Let me start with a commercial interruption. This is the last for the next 50 minutes. I work for the NTSB, and at the NTSB, we're in charge of determining probable cause in accidents and making recommendations to improve safety in all modes. I'm working in the Office of Aviation Safety, and the NTSB, we're basically curious people. We like to try to figure out what happened and why, often to our own detriment. My wife still doesn't get over me asking her when she says that she's sick or has a cold, why? How did you get sick? I just don't learn that. But one of the things that I think all of us share is a deep passion to try to improve safety and keep accidents from happening again. Where there's about 400 of us, we're located in Washington, D.C., and we've got 5 politically appointed board members who serve 5-year terms. We don't have regulatory authority. We can't affect change directly, but through the thoroughness of our investigations, our safety recommendations, and advocacy, talking about our accidents like we're doing today, we can affect change and try to improve safety. One thing that Walt didn't mention in my bio was that several years ago I was an early pioneer in the realm of cardboard aerodynamics, cardboard wing aerodynamics. That wasn't too successful, so I went off to school and got an education in human factors. I now find myself at the safety board, and this slide is to remind me to say that although the work that I'll be talking about today is from our investigators, the safety board investigators, and I'm a member of the safety board staff, the words that I'm going to say today are my own and not necessarily those of the agency. What I'd like to do in today's talk is survey accidents involving maneuvering phase of flight and discuss causal factors and prevention. In doing so, I'd like to we have 3 legs of our journey. The first leg, we're going to be talking about safety reductions when operating down low, hazards in that low altitude regimen of flight. Then we're going to move over to the airport and talk about maneuvering accidents that occurred in the airport traffic pattern. And then the last leg of this journey, we'll pull out of the airport pattern and start talking about decision-making and distractions that occur elsewhere in flight that lead to maneuvering flight loss of control accidents. I don't necessarily have all the answers. Walt called me an expert. I prefer to say I'm a specialist. I'm a student of human factors. And we rely on other pilots. We need to know what's going on. And so hopefully this seminar today will be a dialogue. We can share together, share information, share wisdom, and talk about accidents. One of the most important things when thinking about looking at an accident, it's all too easy to just dismiss an accident or particular human's error as that was just a dumb pilot, a stupid pilot trick. We can't do that as investigators because that prevents us from understanding why the accident happened and, most importantly, trying to prevent the accident, the next one from happening. So we need to pull back and take on the mindset that none of the pilots that we'll be talking about today woke up that morning saying, today is the day that I'm going to destroy my airplane or destroy someone's property. Today is the day that I'm going to have an accident and injure myself, kill myself, or injure or kill someone else. So we need to step back and say, it made sense to these pilots at the time. Why did it make sense? And what can we do to prevent it from happening? With that preamble, let's begin. This is a maneuvering flight accident, a stereotypical accident that involves maneuvering, or an aspect of our industry that involves maneuvering, that is aerial spray application, a crop duster. And this accident occurred with a 2,300-hour commercial pilot, and he made a mistake. He struck unmarked wires during a turn to reverse direction. What's the biggest challenge for this type of operation? An operation in which the pilot, by necessity, as part of their job, has to operate down low. Well, the challenges involve detecting hazards, maintaining energy, and the concept is everything is happening very, very fast. There's a lot to pay attention to in that information-rich environment down low to the ground. This is another working pilot, a pipeline patrol pilot. This pilot, too, has to work close to the ground, a very challenging environment. The pilot here was inspecting a pipeline and was reversing direction around the tank farm there on the sectional chart. Was reversing direction, and it was your typical day, a broken overcast layer or shelved overcast layer, and as the pilot reversed direction and started heading back along the pipeline, he was making a climbing left-hand turn. The sun came out from under the shelf of clouds, momentarily got in his eyes. He's adjusting his sun visor. He's distracted from his primary task in terms of that climbing left-hand turn, and struck a 320-foot tower along his route of flight. He didn't see it. He struck the tower. He survived. And you can see here, after the accident, he told the safety board as part of his write-up of the accident, some issues here as far as the distractions and how it played a role. But he also discusses the concept of complacency and the challenge in dividing attention, as can be seen in this quote. He talks about the concept of a comfort zone, that we ease ourselves in to an area of operation where if nothing bad has happened to us before, we sort of continue operating along that path. And we don't necessarily see the risks that are right in front of us as we're doing those operations. So the onus for us is to try to sit forward on our seats when we fly. Not be scared, not be frightened, but to try to be vigilant and aware of the hazards that are in our operating environment and try to establish countermeasures to protect against them. In this case, you can mitigate risk through pre-planning the route, through identifying hazards along the flight path. In the case of that aerial spray applicator, they accept the risk as far as the potential for accidents, and that pilot walked away because of the aircraft structure, the roll cage, and so there are ways to mitigate risk if you have to operate down low, especially as part of the job in which you're flying. In this case, we'll again stay with the concept of a working pilot, and we will talk about an accident involving an instructional flight. Student pilot and a flight instructor who had 1,300 hours were doing a off-airport emergency landing drill, power out drill, and they got down to about 50 to 100 feet when they struck a wire. They originally thought it was a bird. They flew back to the airport. That's the damage to the vertical. So they came underneath the wire in their low approach doing the simulated engine out performance. Did they need to be down this low? The answer is no. I see a lot of shaking heads. What could they have done to have performed this maneuver in a safer manner? Basically restating, setting a floor altitude, setting an altitude where they're not going to descend below. The concept of planning, thinking the maneuver through before executing it, especially in an operation where they don't have to be operating that low to the ground. That helps increase the margin of safety. This next accident does not involve an instructional flight, is not involving a working pilot, but also resulted in a low altitude wire strike. We had a private pilot who was out dispersing remains from their father-in-law over a cemetery for a ceremony. And they struck wires while going across the cemetery. The window came in, they were slightly injured, but they were able to make it back to the airport. What could these pilots have done differently? Fly higher? The other concept is they could have chosen to, there may have been some involvement or some loss of focus or target fixation, per se, as a result of the fact that it was the father-in-law's ashes in the plane and it was the son-in-law who was doing the flight versus a third party. But the other concept would be ground reconnaissance. Actually, if you're going to do this, go down, assess the hazards. It's part of the pre-planning, the risk mitigation that needs to have happen before. Our next accident involves a call for a pickup. And this doesn't involve a cell phone call from an airplane, but in this case we had a pilot who was out flying some passengers around, did not have a lot of experience, only 180 hours in the last 7 years, and not much time in the last 90 days. The question of carrying passengers aside, let's pull back and ask what happened. The call for pickup was actually a prearranged signal that the pilot had with his wife, where when he was done flying for the day, he was going to orbit the house a couple of times as a signal to his wife that he subsequently needed a ride to the airport. She then left the house, was driving down the road to go pick up her husband, and she noticed in her rearview mirror her husband's airplane in the rearview mirror. So he's low. She later saw the airplane nosedive into the ground. He struck wires 70 feet over the ground, over the road there, and was killed. Again, we've got a 44-year-old pilot, married, not a lot of experience, and this must have made sense to him at the time. But I think if I ask, does it make sense to this audience, I'm going to see nothing but shaking heads. No, it doesn't make sense. But what part of his training, education, or experience that he had did he miss having the appreciation for risk or hazards of operating in this environment? What we need to do as a community is try to figure out ways in our education programs, in our pilot training, and as peers to give pilots forethought or foresight to appreciate risk and change courses of events. This next crash, we were talking about a low-time pilot who snagged wires over a road. This is a higher-time pilot. This pilot had 4,400 hours, ATP rated, had previously flown for a regional airline and a cargo airline. And at 11 o'clock at night, over Interstate 81 in Virginia, snagged high-tension power lines crossing the road. What was going on here? And it's a very challenging task that he was doing, because what he was doing was he was talking on the cell phone to a friend who was driving in a car on the road on Interstate 81, and he was showing the friend in the car what the airplane looked like at night. When the friend, as you can see in this written statement, saw the airplane hit the wires, explode, and crash into the ground. It was a challenging divided attention task, but unlike the pipeline patrol that we talked about earlier, this pilot did not need to be down there. A more appropriate way to show a friend what your airplane looks like at night is not to fly over them while they're driving, while you're talking on the cell phone, but invite them to the airport. If they need to see it from the ground, do some pattern operations at night and bring them along if they want the ride. But it's impoverished visual conditions, and this was a more experienced pilot. Somewhere along the line, this pilot did not have that true appreciation for risk that operating at 11 o'clock at night, impoverished visual conditions, over a road at low altitude, and doing a divided attention task was something that may not need to be done. How did this airplane get here? It's a Baron, and no, did not run off the end of the runway. This airplane actually it stalled. It was relatively low attitude impact, and the pilot and 4 passengers on board were killed. What was happening was a 4,700-hour private pilot was taking passengers up for a local flight, a sightseeing flight. There was a work team at a camp in Nevada at a ranch, and he was taking passengers up to overfly the local area during the day. When we talked to witnesses during this investigation, the witnesses were saying that the airplane was seen making 2 or 3 low passes over the working group, and the witnesses estimated the airspeeds to be around, or the altitude to be around 100 to 300 feet above the ground. They saw the airplane make a sudden steep pitch up, climbing left turn, approaching 90 degrees, and then sort of stalled out and crashed nose first into the ground. A GPS on board showed that the ground speed during some of these passes, these low altitude passes, was approaching 120 knots. One witness thought it was a crop duster, but in this case it wasn't a crop duster. This pilot did not need to be operating down that low. And a witness up on the mountain actually took some pictures of this airplane. So we weren't relying necessarily or exclusively on eyewitness testimony, but we had photo evidence of this airplane as it's moved across the valley floor there. And as you can see, if I zoom up that last picture, that airplane's only about 3 or 4 wingspans from the ground when it's doing its maneuvering. How do you prevent an accident like this? Don't go buzzing a work area. And is this a very good way to share general aviation with people who may not be necessarily familiar with general aviation? Yeah, it may have been all he had. But the other question I want to pose to the group is that climbing left-hand turn where he stalled out, would it make a difference if the reason for that aggressive climbing left-hand turn was a bird or a balloon or some other obstacle that he was trying to avoid? Would it make a difference in our assessment of whether this was a good idea to do or not, or whether this pilot really needed to be down there? And I'm seeing heads shaking no. And the reason is that the pilot is operating down low to the ground. There is very little margin for error. They did not afford themselves the ability to recover from surprise or anything unexpected happening in their task environment. Sometimes pilots, who survive accidents, actually will draw a diagram for us as far as the circumstances of the event. And in this case, what we have is a pilot here who was out doing a sightseeing flight. They're the only person in the airplane, and as they're returning to the airport, they saw a friend of theirs on the road while they were driving. But you see here what happens is the airplane landed. I don't think that's a bat. I guess those are 2 dragonflies. But the airplane landed on a dirt road off airport, didn't get to the airport. Why did it land on the dirt road? Well, what we often don't see in these maps that pilots draw for us is statements like, where I hit the SUV. And again, we can laugh here, but the concept is this made sense to this pilot at this time. He saw the friend, and so he did a 180 turn, and he was going to do a strafing run, fly over his friend, as his friend was driving on that dirt road. He wound up putting his friend into the hospital, and that's the tire track of his left main gear as he went over the car. The gear fell off. He then came back around to land on that dirt road to check on his friend. Again, what would you think the age of this pilot might be? And that's the answer was 22, in the 20s, and that's the stereotypical response. We're thinking, okay, that's the young risk taker. That's the person that shouldn't know better. This pilot was actually 70. This pilot should have known better. And our challenge as a community is how do we get in touch with pilots like this to say, you know, it's okay to look down, it's okay to see friends on the ground, but it's a lot safer to get to the airport, call your friend, or the next time you have a drink with your friend to say, hey, I saw you on the air, I know where you were. Surprise them that you knew what they were up to because you saw them from the air, not necessarily have them see you or have this up close and personal contact. 70 years old. Now remember what we were all taught when we were private pilots as far as when we were going through our flight training, when we're operating down low, when we're doing our ground reference maneuvers. Didn't we have a set of checklists that we go through? What were some of the things on that checklist? Or one of the primary things before we started letting down to do our maneuvers, what was one of the things that we were supposed to do? Clear the area. And then what we would do. One of the things I was taught, clear the area, and then make sure you pick where you're going if something happens. Where's your outfield? Where are you going? You're letting down into an area so that you have an outfield. If something were to happen while you're doing your maneuvers, you know where you're going. Well, this pilot was out checking deer stands and orbiting, looking at the deer stands on his property, and noticed that his Piper Light Sport was starting to descend, had lost altitude. He didn't catch it. He didn't arrest it. When he tried to arrest it while it was happening, when he tried to arrest the power or the descent, he applied power. There was no power to be had. The engine had frozen up, carburizing. He wound up stopping, and as you see in that bottom left-hand picture, when the airplane was recovered, put on a set of blocks, the engine ran quite fine. There was nothing wrong with the engine. But again, this pilot just didn't work through the basic checklist. Let's go back to that tower pilot who was talking about that comfort zone, that sense of complacency. This pilot clearly had a sense of complacency that they didn't need to clear the area. They didn't need to follow the checklist. Hey, we're going into a low power state. Maybe we need to apply carb heat to protect ourselves, to minimize or to mitigate the risks of the environment that we're starting to operate within. I'd be remiss if I didn't show, when we're talking about maneuvering accidents happening low to the ground, this famous accident involving Corey Lytle in the East River in New York. Don't need to belabor the point, but that was the route of flight from Teterboro, and we had a CFI in that plane that wasn't necessarily familiar with the local area. They hit the building about 332 feet up. And what was happening was they were making that left-hand turn to avoid the Class B airspace, and were making it in a downwind direction. So they were getting pushed as they're turning. And instead of accepting the concept of an altitude bust, climbing up or exceeding the limits of that airspace, they unfortunately hit the building. And the probable cause cited in this case, planning and judgment and experience of the pilots involved. Our accident reports for surviving pilots, they afford us an opportunity to hear from the pilots. How could they have prevented the accident from happening again? And here we have, do not fly low over objects. This accident could have been prevented by keeping my altitude higher, following regulations, all things that we've seen in these last few accidents. There's not much time to react when you're operating down low. And if you need to, the concept is, what's the plan? We need to plan and for ways that identify the hazards in advance and mitigate the risk that we're going to face in some way. And the concept is, if there's no need to be operating down that low, we should ask ourselves, why are we doing so? How's it going to look in the accident report? Is it justifiable? Do we really need to be operating that low? Well, some of these accidents may have involved cases where you'd say to yourself, I don't operate down that low. I don't carry my father-in-law's ashes. I don't even fly with my father-in-law. So these don't apply to me. But all of us, in some way, shape, or form, have to get back to the airport or leave from the airport and operate in the traffic pattern. So let's pull away from these intentional operations near the ground to necessary operations near the ground as we come into and out of an airport, and talk about maneuvering flight loss of control accidents there. This is the airplane that I soloed in a few days after I soloed. It was a pretty airplane, and this is the airplane several years later. It crashed short of the runway going into York, Pennsylvania, and it was an operation involving pattern operations. It killed the pilot. And what was happening was the pilot was coming into the pattern, there was a helicopter in the pattern, and it was your classical, where are you? Do we have separation? And trying to maintain self-separation. The pilot lost focus of airspeed and wound up stalling short of the runway. The pilot was not necessarily inexperienced with 1,500 hours and was reasonably current with 80 hours in the year. This pilot was flying almost every weekend. But these types of accidents don't necessarily happen just at non-towered airports. Here's a pilot who was looking for traffic and concerned about spacing, and asked the controller for S-turns as they were being called out, pointed out traffic in front of them. They saw the traffic, and then they asked the controller themselves, could we have some S-turns for spacing? The controller approved the S-turns, But during the S-turns, what happened was this pilot lost their energy management and stalled and crashed short of the airfield. Why? They were probably focused on traffic avoidance instead of flying the airplane. They lost their situation awareness. And we don't know the extent to which it played a role, but clearly we should be able to respond in a low energy state and get ourselves out to apply power and get that airplane, get that airfoil back flying again. So keeping the skills up is important. This is a much higher performance aircraft. This pilot had 975 hours and had transitioned into this airplane just a month or two before, had only 44 hours in it, and was previously experienced in a much smaller, lower powered airplane. The airplane up on top, and then that's the recovered wreckage laid out on the bottom. What happened was the airplane was coming in for landing. It was in a normal landing configuration, and the witnesses saw the airplane wing over, go onto its back, and drop straight down. Well, what happened here, and for those of you that may not be able to read this, the airplane was, instead of asking for S-turns on their own for separation, was being asked to fly S-turns for separation by the controller. Controller wanted to get one more departure out, ask this airplane for S-turns, and turn final, fly across the final, make an S-turn so I can get 2 departures off. The airplane acknowledged. And going through the S-turns, what happened was the airplane lost its energy and crashed short of the runway. How do you prevent this type of accident?
Don't make S-turns.
Don't make S-turns. Go around.
Make a 360 instead.
360, we'll get to that. Thank you for the foreshadowing, but I'll hold that. But I think I heard someone say unable. That's right, and the common theme as we move through is we are the pilot in command. It's our responsibility to be proficient. It's our responsibility to know the performance limitations of our airplane, and it's our responsibility to ensure that what we're doing up there allows us to successfully get back down here. And if we need to make a phone call on the ground when we get back, if we need to embarrass ourselves, those are things that are okay to do, short of crashing short of the runway. Another one where a pilot might have needed to say unable or could have said unable, but has some slight different issues involved in it. This is a banner tow pilot, and in this accident, about 6 days before the accident, they drop off their banner on the left side of this runway, 36 left, and they used to fly crosswind and head off to a right downwind for 36 right and get into the pattern. The local operations there had changed where what they were now being asked to do was they dropped the banner off on the left of 36, and then they needed to do a 180 on the north side between the 2 runways, come down, and then do a 180 on the south side between the 2 runways and land basically left base for 36 right. That had been going on for about 6 days prior. The 6th day into it, this pilot crashed, got low, or got slow, stalled out in the turn. And so in this case, we had some procedural issues. The pilot could have said unable, but we also had a system issue that magnifies the vulnerability when we're operating at steep attitudes close to the ground. We had an issue here where the airspeed indicator was reading a few knots high, so he didn't have a complete picture or a true awareness of where he was as far as his airplane goes, and the stall warning was inoperative. So he didn't get the cues he needed early to correct, but at the same time, this could have been prevented with a unable, or why are we doing this? Let's go back to the previous procedures. And we've had these types of accidents here at Sun and Fun. 5 years ago, airplane was coming in, high performance. This pilot only had high performance experimental, only had 613 hours, but about 15 hours in the months before Sun and Fun. 12 years prior had come into Sun and Fun and had told his wife that, quote, they'd come in a 182, I believe, had told his wife that Sun and Fun was exhilarating and scary at the same time. And it is a challenging environment when you're coming into a fly-in environment. High-density traffic, procedures that are not necessarily those that you're familiar with or used to flying. And there's sort of a expectation of performance. You don't want to be the one that does something stupid. You don't want to be the one that goes around. You want to demonstrate your proficiency as a pilot. But in this case, the pilot was overshooting the runway, and the controller called them to say, hey, turn your base and don't overshoot, but the airplane stalled out while doing the base to final turn. And there we just need to be capable and proficient of understanding the speed ranges of our airplane and be able to demonstrate proficiency throughout those speed ranges. Continuing the concept of working with air traffic controllers, this is an accident that happened in Clearwater, Florida, involving a 172 that was flown by a 171-hour private pilot with 2 passengers. The last flight was logged about 3 months earlier, but they did have 80 hours in this airplane. As they were coming in from the southwest, they were given basically they were given clearance to land on runway 22. As they were approaching the airport, they turned towards 27 and made a sharp right turn to adjust their pattern to 22. The controller dialogue there that may not be visible is, land 22, hold short of 17. The pilot acknowledged that clearance, and then subsequently, the controller queried them and said, verify that you're lined up for runway 22. The 172 pilot said, 00 Quebec, sorry about that. At which point the airplane crashed short of the runway in the bay. Clearly, the concept was the pilot was approaching the airport, lost their situation awareness, and lost orientation of where they were exactly going, was called out by the controller saying, wait, are you sure you're going to where I want you to go? And instead of confessing and dealing with, hey, look, we're not set up to do this, I screwed up, they aggressively tried to maneuver the airplane to correct their mistake and lost their lives in the process. The concept of just jotting, doing the airport diagram on your knee board to maintain your orientation comes into mind. The airplane was just about 25 pounds or 24 pounds over max gross weight. Based on the loading and the concept there, I guess you could add that once you start entering into that, you're working outside the flight envelope, you're now a test pilot. So that's also affecting the circumstances of this event. Yes, just additional weight. Let's move away from air traffic operations and the whole concept of saying unable and talk about the base to final turn. That's where a lot of these maneuvering flight accidents happen, the stall spin. In this case, pilots coming in, does a midfield crosswind for that runway, does their downwind, their downwind, and then the base turn has the wind pushing them. They overfly the center line, try to correct, and wind up crashing. This was actually a flight instructional event involving a Cirrus aircraft who was on let me get this started, and here's a simulation from the data, or animation from the data that were on that airplane. The airplane's coming back from a flight review. As it's making this turn, the data are showing that the power is being pulled, is going down to low RPMs, and the pilot's turning. They were heading in for a downwind for that run a bit, but now they're crossing over. What likely is happening around here? Perhaps the flight instructor in the flight review had pulled power for a simulated emergency landing. The pilot's correcting or trying to turn base, turn final, but overshot the runway and is steepening up the turn to correct, and ultimately the airplane snapped over to the right. It was a flight review. We had a pilot and an instructor on board. We have issues as far as planning. How are we going to conduct the maneuvers? How are we going to accept failure? How are we going to reset and recycle and try this maneuver again? It's okay that the concept of coming in and doing a simulated engine out as you're approaching the airport, that's okay to do. We expect that. But if they blew that maneuver, call it, hey, look, could I have a reset? Could we do that again? Versus, I think I can make this. I think I can get this back to the airport. This accident involved no flight instruction, but there were 2 people on board here. It was a mall on floats, a local cross-country flight, and heading in towards the airport. Flew out west, did a little teardrop, came back in, teardrop around, and wound up stalling short on as they turned base to final. What was going on here was this pilot, who was trying a couple months before, was transitioning into a more high-performance aircraft. The flight instructor had identified in multiple flights with that pilot a tendency for this pilot to be making 45-degree bank turns in the pattern, so turns that were far steeper than you needed to make, and had described the pilot as ham-fisted, said they didn't properly recover the airplane after the stall warning horn occurred and needed to be coached through the stall recovery. And the pilot later sought another instructor to help them finish the transition training into the higher performance aircraft. The question here is, how do we as a community, how do we improve safety here where we've got a flight instructor who's identifying a potential issue with the pilot's proficiency, skills and abilities, to how do we apply that or how do we correct that in the future? And the challenge is, this isn't a primary student, so when you already have your license, the gates are not all that tight that a flight instructor can have you move through. Any thoughts there? Yes, sir. So better dialogue and coordination and standards among flight instructors would help do this, especially in the post-primary instruction. We talked about somebody mentioned 360s, and thank you for bringing that up. The concept of 360s on downwind. This was another flight review underway. We had the pilot in the front seat of this RV-8, the CFI in the back seat of the RV-8, and they were doing a flight review in the state of Washington, flew off to this small airport, and they landed to the east on runway 9. Turned around, took off, going back out to the west, flew around, and then they're coming in to re-enter the pattern right downwind for runway 27. And witnesses observed the airplane enter a steep right-hand bank, estimated around 60 degrees of bank. And as the airplane came around about 360 degrees into the turn, it snapped left and went into the ground. And so that was the RV-8 before. This was the RV-8 after it was recovered from the field that it crashed in about a quarter mile north of that airport. The question is, what was the purpose of doing that 360? And is there a purpose of doing that 360? What sort of advanced planning was done by these 2 pilots? What sort of awareness was done by these 2 pilots while they were flying this maneuver? And if there was a need to do a 360 in the pattern, could it have been done at an angle of bank less than the steep angle of bank that they executed it at? There isn't much room for recovery when we're operating near to the ground. This is no different than operating near to the ground when for the folks out there in that first leg of our journey who were hitting things while they were operating. We still have very little room for error here. This next one is a 360 for altitude. And in this case, a Cirrus was coming towards the airport and wound up crashing short of the runway on airport property. It had data on board. Apologize for the green data trace there, but let's break it down. About 5 miles out, they called the tower, or they called the tower early and asked for a straight into runway 22. They were cleared the straight in for runway 22. About 5 miles out, they were too high. They were at 3,800 feet. They asked for a 360. The 360 was approved. When they completed the 360, they reported in at a 3-mile final for runway 22 at 2,200 feet. And the issue here is runway 22 is actually in that direction. They were lined up for runway 29 throughout the approach. Advanced technology aircraft, GPS on board, heading, using autopilot, heading select, nav mode, but they were coming up on the wrong runway. Clear confirmation bias. They think that they're working on runway 22, and it wasn't until they probably saw 29 over the threshold that they said, whoa, this isn't good, and they tried to bank it into runway 22 and landed short of the airport, or crashed, stalled out there. In this case, there may have been some urgency, why they didn't go around, embarrassment with the controller, but they also were late for their flight. Let me just move forward a little bit. This is a landing go-around. And basically here, every pilot, the recommendation from the pilots, every pilot do stall training. And there's a lot going on, and practice is necessary to stay safe. Let me wrap up with one final case study. And we have this airplane crashed after a long day at the airport. The airplane had undergone a maintenance event where it was getting a panel change out, and on an earlier test flight that day, there were some high fuel pressure readings. And they wound up spending the next part of the 3 or 4 hours trying to troubleshoot those spurious fuel pressure readings, unhooking hoses, rehooking. They finally got things fixed. The pilot now is late for a commercial flight, tired from staying there all day, and launched off to fly home to try to catch that commercial flight. About 4,500 feet, the engine stopped. He called for a emergency outfield, found one, and landed at the airport, stalled it out on the base to final turn, and landed hard, damaging, almost destroying this airplane. After landing, the right fuel tank had fuel in it. The left fuel tank had no fuel in it. The pilot took off with the fuel selector on the left and didn't change it, didn't check it when the engine stopped. And the pilot told us that he made a whole bunch of errors on the flight, and let's just step through the errors that he made. Didn't just leave the pressure indication problem alone and just completing the trip earlier, not stopping the mechanical work earlier. This was a 3-hour delay. We've been there where you want to get going, you want to get home, you're tired, frustrating. He didn't do a thorough walk around. He didn't complete the checklist. He took off tired, frustrated, and angry, and he wasn't monitoring the fuel. When the engine stopped, he fixated on the concept of, oh, this has to be related to the previous maintenance work. This isn't because maybe I need to check the fuel. Didn't follow the checklist up there, and he kind of wished that in hindsight he'd just gone and flown to, gotten a ride to the airport instead of driving, and then he could have picked up his airplane when he was fresh on a cool day and departed clear of mind. And this is a good quote from this pilot. The last thing I wanted to leave you with is, I'm a student of human factors, but I'm also human. Even though I know all the ways that people can make mistakes and I evaluate my mistake, or evaluate the mistakes of others as part of my job, I'm not immune to making those same mistakes. And what happened here was something that happened very similar to that pilot who was landing on runway 22. My airplane has 2 GPS. It's a 172, but it's got a nice sophisticated panel. I try to maintain my awareness. I was flying IFR one day. I came through the bases, and air traffic called the airport and basically said airport's 5 miles at 12 o'clock. I called the airport in sight. I'd never been to this airport before. I had an expectation. I'd seen it on Google Earth. I thought I knew what I was doing. I thought I was doing good, proper planning. But as you can see on the slide here, the green line is the 12 o'clock to the airport that the controller was calling me. When I came out of the bases, I was seeing this airport over here. And I proceeded straight to that airport. I'm making my position calls. for some reason, I'm not referencing my GPS anymore. I'm looking out. Why am I looking out? Because another airplane is announcing that they're about the same distance from the airport that I am, and now I'm in a traffic vigilance mode. I'm looking out, and I've shed a lot of my workload. Inappropriately so, because I'm starting to head closer to that Class C airport, and it wasn't until I saw a regional jet turning close to me, and my brain is saying, boy, they really dropped those regional jets close to this small little airport that I'm going into, that I then woke up. That was my runway 29. That's when I woke up and I said, wait, I've just made a mistake. I need to double back and get into the right airport, get out of the airspace that I'd penetrated. So the concept is human factors is something that we're all vulnerable to, even somebody who is specialized in human factors. And the thing that we need to try to do as far as maneuvering flight and loss of control accidents is change history. They say history repeats itself, and loss of control during maneuvering flight was something that early pioneers of flight struggled to overcome. More than 100 years later, we're still talking about it. And this accident involving the Wright Flyer happened in 2009 at Huffman's Prairie in Dayton, Ohio. The basic factors that lead to safety in this phase of flight have not changed. They involve good planning, good decisions, honed skills and proficiency, and speed awareness. In other words, we need to think ahead in advance of the flight. We need to think ahead of the airplane in flight and about the accident report if in doubt. We have to ask ourselves, can we stop history from repeating as it relates to maneuvering flight and loss of control? Thank you.